what I'd like us to talk about this morning is what I call intermediate marketing metrics. I mean, up to this point, we have talked about cash flow. We've talked about forecasting demand so that you could ultimately estimate cash flow. But to a large degree, what we've done is we've talked about things that happen on the front end, marketing activities, marketing expenditures, product design, and things that happen at the back end, demand, cash flow, and so forth. There's an awful lot that happens in the middle, and most of that is what marketing is about. And so it's really hard to do anything in the way of diagnostics to manage the process if all you've got is a black box. You know, like putting money and activities in, and money is coming out the other end. Money stops coming out the other end. You don't have any information about what to do. If it suddenly increases, that's great, except you don't necessarily know why that's happening. So it's important to sort of look inside the black box, and to a large extent, that's what these intermediate marketing metrics are all about. They're the kinds of measures that you will use routinely if you're in a marketing job. Some of them you will use in some types of jobs, some will you use in other types of jobs. But we have no shortage of measures of outcomes that are related to marketing and measures of efficiency. That is, what are we getting from what we're buying? Most organizations these days of any size typically have a dashboard of some kind, not unlike what you have in the bikes simulation. They may look different. Here's an example of an executive marketing dashboard. There's some customer metrics here, things like lifetime value of a customer. We'll talk about that later in the course. Share of wallet, share of mind, some brand metrics. What do people know about your brand? Some efficiency metrics, cost per acquisition, cost per thousand, some revenue metrics, market share, margins, and so forth. But it's all there right on one screen, so you can kind of get a sense of how you're performing at any one point in time. And if you see something that's concerning, either because it's negative or it's positive, then you may go in and try to understand and diagnose what the issue is. I'd love to tell you that there is one measure, or just a handful of measures, that you should look at, but the reality is that different business models require different kinds of measures. So if you're, for example, selling subscriptions, you'll be looking at things very different than if you're selling food products through retail grocery stores. So depending on the decisions that you have, depending on your job, you may be looking at different metrics. Most of the information you're going to look at will have some cost, and you've got to weigh the cost of obtaining the information relative to the benefit. As we've said before, information is most useful when uncertainty is high and when the cost of being wrong is high. But in any given job, there's probably a small number of really critical metrics you need to be paying attention to on a regular basis. And these are often referred to as KPIs, or key performance indicators. But they will vary depending on the firm, depending on its business model, depending on who is using the information. So your KPIs may be somewhat different than the KPIs for somebody in a different part of the organization. When you begin to think in terms of decisions and how you're going to use information to make decisions, you might want to think about what kind of decision you're making. And broad brush, there are really four broad types of decision situations that you may encounter. One is, early on, what are the opportunities? Are there opportunities in the marketplace? Are there opportunities for a competitive response? Are there opportunities to develop a market? And if so, what are the options available for developing those opportunities? This is kind of a creative exercise. You've got to learn a lot about the customers. You may spend a lot of time talking to customers in detail about what their needs are, their dissatisfaction with current solutions, their desire for solutions they don't have, problems they'd like to have solved. And that's the type of information that would really be useful. And then you can begin to figure out how many people have those kinds of problems or needs, and how many are unmet because they're not competitive alternatives in the market, and then whether the opportunity is worthwhile. Once you've identified whether the opportunity is worthwhile, then you may need to actually generate alternatives. And yes, consumers can help you with that as well, but this is often done in a product context with R&D. What's the physical product that we could actually create? Or it may be done with service operations in a service business. What's the service that we could create? You may also find that the same thing occurs in the context of advertising. What are the alternatives in terms of communication? What are the in terms of what message we might create, in terms of what media we might create? And once I've then generated alternatives, then I can ask the question, which is best? But notice I really can't answer that question until I've got some real alternatives. I see a lot of folks making decisions about really unspecified, poorly specified alternatives. One of the things that often happens is you develop a value proposition, send it off to the ad agency, and what you get back doesn't have the value proposition in it. Happens all the time. And you can figure that out often just by looking at the creative work. But sometimes you actually need to do a test. Show the ad to a small group of people, maybe a few hundred, and see how people respond. And then finally, once you've selected alternatives for action, you implement, and you need to monitor performance. Is it working the way we intended? We've got a new product in the market, are people accepting it? We just ran a new ad. How many people are aware that the ad ran? We have a new distribution channel. How many people are buying through that distribution channel? How many people are satisfied with our product? And these things frequently will be monitored on an ongoing basis. Really, there are kind of 6 generic business questions that you need to answer. I mean, first of all, what are the alternatives? What do we have that we can actually do? Which one of those is best? How are we doing in the marketplace with what we already got out there? What is out there? What's out there in terms of customers, competitors, the economic environment? The forecasting question, how much will we achieve? And then a couple of diagnostic questions. Why is something occurring? Suddenly sales are down on the West Coast. I wonder why. Might actually be obvious. Could be, they had a big earthquake. People didn't go to the stores. Or it might not be so obvious. It might well be that some competitor has entered the market and is taking share from you. It's not quite so obvious. It certainly doesn't make the national news. And then there's a question, also diagnostic, but it really revolves around what are the discontinuities? And by discontinuity, I mean what are the things that might occur that could radically alter the environment, that could radically alter the marketplace, that could change the way customers do business or change their needs or wants. That could be technology. So, for example, putting a camera on a phone is a discontinuity. By the way, Apple has killed the watch market. Not Apple's watch market, but the larger watch market. That's a discontinuity. And who would have ever thought that Apple, a computer company, would have become the leading watch company? That's a discontinuity. And those are the kinds of things you want to look out and see if you can identify. And we can overlay those generic questions and those decision-making situations on top of one another and really identify kind of three broad areas where we need measures. There are things about what's out there, how are we doing, that relate to opportunities and measure current performance. Those are kind of descriptive measures. There are things around the generation of alternatives and perhaps why things are occurring. We call that exploratory research. Focus groups would fit in that category. And then there's evaluative research, where we're testing and selecting alternatives. And so the measures that I want to use will depend in part on what kind of question I'm trying to answer. It's also important to make a distinction between a measure and a metric. A measure is a single piece of data at a specific point in time. So it could be sales in the last quarter. It could be market share in the last quarter. It could be customer satisfaction. But all that is just a statement of fact at a particular point in time. It doesn't really tell us what to do. In contrast, a metric is a measure in a context. It provides information about performance. So, for example, instead of sales last quarter, how do sales last quarter compare to the quarter before that? Or a year ago? Now I have some sense of change. So a metric is really about change. Or instead of just market share at a given point in time, what's the change in market share? Has my market share gone up this month or gone down this month? Customer satisfaction. It's nice to know people's level of satisfaction, but how does that compare, say, to your closest competitor? Are you higher or lower than your nearest competitor? Now that gives you some information about performance. So metrics are really about performance, and it requires a context. There are all kinds of different measures and metrics, and they're really based on how they're used. There are lots of what we call diagnostic measures that answer questions about how and why. So why are we losing customers? How can we retain customers? Here we simply need to first specify what are we trying to diagnose. In contrast, there are evaluative measures that really address how we're doing. Is there an increase in the number of customers? We probably wouldn't ask the question, why are we losing customers, or how can we retain customers, unless we had some information that there's been a change in the number of customers. Are customers buying more or less from us? These are the kinds of information that might give rise to diagnostic measures. Generally, evaluative measures, how we're doing, will be what's on the dashboard. We pay attention to them quickly. Oh, nothing's changed, that's a good thing. Sometimes. Well, then we don't need to do anything more in the way of gathering information. Or, oops, something has really changed, now we need to drill down and figure out why. There are a lot of measures that we use that are essentially descriptive. They describe the current or present state. A lot of what we call tracking studies, doing surveys that ask people what products are you aware of in the category. There are firms that literally make a few calls every night and ask, if you were going to buy a car next time, what car would you buy? What cars would you consider? And they capture that information literally on a daily basis to see what changes are occurring. And then they may relate that to things like advertising campaigns, rebates, other promotions, and so forth, which are really designed to describe what we hope the future will be like. Sales forecasts are a really good example. Again, they're always based on assumptions, and when we talked about forecasting earlier in the course, we talked about the need to kind of document, make clear what your assumptions are. There are also measures of process versus measures of outcome. Process measures are measures of steps as you're trying to get to a final result. They can often be used diagnostically. Outcomes are really measures of the desired state, a sale, for example. So here's an example of a set of process measures. You may see them referred to as a marketing funnel. You may see them referred to as a customer journey, depending on your point of view. If you're looking at the world from the standpoint of the marketer, you may look at the marketing funnel. If you're looking at the world from the standpoint of the customer, you might look at it as the customer journey, but they really map into one another. And you can determine how many customers out there out of the whole market are actually familiar with us, to know anything about us, have ever heard of us. How many of those who have ever heard of us would be willing to actually give us consideration if they were buying? Of those that they would consider, is there one that they prefer the most? And among those who prefer our product, how many are purchasing? And then finally, how many of those who purchase tend to be loyal? They keep coming back and purchase again and again. There are a number of software companies, Microsoft, Salesforce, Oracle, and others, that in fact allow you to capture this information for your marketplace. A lot of Salesforce management software really tries to determine what numbers of customers are in these categories and then allocate Salesforce effort to these according to where they see a need. But here we're looking at a process. And in such cases, I might discover that, when people learn about us, they really have a high preference for us. And then, they're inclined to buy from us. But you know what? Not many people are aware of us. If that's the case, then we need to go and work on awareness. That may be advertising. In business to business, it might be a sales call. But I need to understand where in the process I can intervene to have an effect. And that's why I need these sorts of process measures. I've shown you this before, or a variation of this, again, based on the customer journey. Again, it's just a variation of what I just showed you. It's really a funnel. What percentage of the market is in various states, and we can measure these. All of these things we could actually measure using a survey. And again, if I use a tracking study, I could measure the changes in the states over time, literally daily if I chose to do so. So here's an example just of using the information. Here's, and you've seen this in other forms already. Total market potential is $10 million. 100% of the market. Only 80% are aware of us. So suddenly our available market is only $8 million. Of those who are aware, only about 40% think our product is attractive. So suddenly our available market is down to 3.2 million. And of those who think our product is attractive, only about half currently intend to buy. Maybe they've bought recently, maybe they don't have a need. And now our available Now our market is down to 1.6 million. And people have to be able to get the product. So if only 80% can get the product, suddenly our market is down to only 1.28 million. And of those, only a fraction purchase. So suddenly what looks like a really big market, $10 million, suddenly it isn't such a large market when we begin to look at the process of where people fall. Some measures that we use in marketing are direct measures. They come from objective, available information. Some of it we capture as a part of the transaction with the customer. Things like the dollars in sales or the number of likes on a Facebook page. Those are really direct measures. But there are also measures that we often compute based on other measures. We call these indirect. So they're based on computations of some sort. That means they're really only about as good as the underlying data. One indirect measure that we look at frequently is market share. We don't directly measure market share. Market share is the ratio of our sales to the total sales in the category. Or you can develop variations on that. Our sales compared to the sales of our nearest competitor. It's another way to look at market share. But such derived measures I'll get there in a minute. Such derived measures often carry with them a lot of assumptions. So, for example, if I'm computing market share, how do I define the category? If I'm in the soft drink business, I could define market share based on other soft drinks. What's the total sales, unit sales, dollar sales of soft drinks? Well, that's useful to know. But another way to compute market share would be, what is my market share of the whole beverage category? Suddenly my market share is going to get a lot smaller. And in some cases, soft drinks is a really good example. The beverage market may be the better way to look at things. Because where I'm losing customers is not to other soft drinks, but I'm losing customers to fruit juices and waters and a host of other characteristics. And so now I may want to understand, what is my market share relative to all of those other non-soft drink types of products, which might lead me to move into other markets. Maybe I'm a soft drink manufacturer, a Coca-Cola, and I discover, I'm losing a lot of market share to water. Maybe I need to bring out bottled water as a way to deal with the market. There are other derived measures. Gross rating points. If you've taken an advertising course, you've probably been exposed to gross rating points. Gross rating points are what you buy in broadcast advertising, and they represent a combination of how many households you reach, what percentage of households you reach at least once, and how many times you reach on average each household. It's a frequency measure. So GRPs really represent a kind of combination of reach. Reach defined as how many households I'm reaching at least one time in a given period. And frequency, what's the average number of times the household is being exposed to my ad. And the median networks basically sell you GRPs. Now, the problem with GRPs is that I could expose 1% of households 100 times, or I could expose 100% of households one time, and it's still 100 GRPs. Which would I rather have? That poor household that sees my ad 100 times, probably it's going to be awfully irritating. I'd probably rather have 100% of households seeing the ad once. So it becomes really important to understand what the kind of distribution is. We generally believe, and there's good data on this, that households need to be exposed to an ad about 3 times before it really has an effect. And so when in media scheduling, very often what we try to do is to buy enough GRPs to assure an exposure at least 3 times between purchases. By the way, if it's a household product, consumer product that you use regularly, that may be a week. If it's an automobile, it may be a year or longer. But a GRP is a derived measure, and so yes, we use GRPs all the time. It's actually the currency in buying media, but it's really important to understand how it's derived and what the underlying metrics actually mean. There are absolute measures, or measures that have meaning just standing alone. Dollars spent on advertising. Something I want to know, how much are we spending on advertising? This quarter, next quarter, for the year. But absolute measures often don't give us a really good sense of what's happening in the market. More often, the really useful measures are relative measures. What are we doing relative to a competitor? So, for example, how much am I spending on advertising relative to all the spending in the category? We sometimes refer to that as a share of voice. Turns out that in most circumstances, share of voice and market share tend to be about the same. And if you see a firm whose share of voice is much larger than its market share, it's a good chance that they're trying to buy market share. Relative measures usually tend to be more predictive than absolute measures. We see the same thing with respect to price. Yes, absolute price on a product is important, necessary to know, but what really makes a difference in predicting what people buy is the price of one product relative to competitors' products. So that could be the price of your product versus the average price in the category. It could be your price relative to your nearest competitor's price. A variety of relative measures you compute, but it's because we're in competitive markets that relative information really turns out to be most useful. By the way, if you're looking for jobs and you're concerned about how you get this information, there's a whole industry that just goes out and gets competitive information. They do store audits, walk through stores and figure out what are the prices on all the products in the store, so people can then make comparisons and compute these sorts of relative measures. Some of what we measure are effectiveness measures. Effectiveness measures tell us how well we're doing something. They measure an accomplishment, an achievement. Things like revenue or cumulative net margin. I mean, these are outcomes, and they're really important. I mean, they really tell us whether we're achieving what we intended to achieve, whether we're meeting our goals. But there are a whole bunch of measures we use in marketing that also reflect the efficiency of what we're doing. How much is it costing us to reach an outcome? It's really a measure not of outcome, but of effort. How hard are we working to get the outcome? A measure, I shouldn't say a measure, an outcome, an activity, can never be effective, can never be efficient if it's not effective. If I don't produce what I wanted, it doesn't matter how much or how little it costs. So we really need to put these sorts of efficiency measures in the context of what is it we're trying to accomplish, and am I accomplishing those things? Knowing the cost of a gross rating point is important, but a low cost of a gross rating point isn't really very helpful to me if I'm not reaching the target audience I want to reach. By the way, if you really want to buy cheap television advertising, buy at 3 in the morning. Why is television advertising cheap at 3 in the morning? Yeah.
Because no one's watching.
Nobody's watching, exactly. And you're paying for eyeballs. What GRPs are eyeballs. And if there are relatively few eyeballs, then it's hard to charge a lot for that if you're a media company. On the other hand, for most product categories, not all, they're somewhere 3 o'clock in the morning is the sweet spot. But for most product categories, you're not going to reach the customer you want to reach at 3 o'clock in the morning. So having a really inexpensive media buy doesn't help. It's not really efficient. Yeah.
Do channels always have like a surplus of people wanting to advertise at like that time in the morning, or do they have to like reach out?
Well, they reach out, they make all kinds of deals.
Like because they might not fill like their quota or something. So
They may not. Yeah, and the way the media industry works is really interesting because they will often do deals that require you to buy a 3 in the morning slot in order to get other slots so that they fill their, they can sell their inventory. Or if they don't, I said the currency of media advertising is GRP. If I don't deliver, if I'm a media company and I don't deliver the GRPs you bought, I have to do something called make good. That is, I have to give you the equivalent GRPs that you didn't get. By the way, I usually can do that at my preference. So there are a lot of make goods that show up at 3 in the morning. Because why would I, if I can't sell that space and I can sell other space at a premium, why would I use it for make goods? By the way, if you're in the media business, selling media, make goods are a real problem. For the NFL, for example, if you have a really dull game, guess what? People tune out. People pay, this past year, 30 seconds in the Super Bowl cost $5.5 million. And it was based on the number of GRPs that the Super Bowl was going to deliver. Fortunately, this year the Super Bowl was interesting. But there have been years when the Super Bowl has been very dull, and by about the fourth quarter, half the audience literally has tuned out. Guess what? The media company didn't deliver the GRPs. Now they've got to make it good. The problem from an advertiser perspective is, yeah, I got the GRPs that I bought, except they're not really where I wanted them to be. Gee, I wanted those GRPs in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl, and I got them at 3 o'clock in the morning. We have lots and lots and lots of measures in marketing, and you should, at least in the U.S., there is no reason why you shouldn't know about your marketing, even if you're a small business. There are measures that you can capture as part of the transaction. There's relatively inexpensive data that you can get for free or at low cost. We don't have a problem with measures. in the U.S. If you go to some international markets, there aren't measures. But one of the reasons why the U.S. market is so attractive to international firms is it's so easy to get in the market. It's so transparent. I mean, we've got all kinds of information people can learn about our markets. Now, pick a market like India. There's not really the equivalent of Nielsen in India. And yeah, Nielsen is in India, but it doesn't have the kind of data that we have in the United States. So some examples, but there are lots of measures, but they often have the same name, but they're actually measuring something different. And so it really becomes important as you look at measures, you buy data, whether you're buying data from a firm that collects and resells data, or whether you're paying a firm to collect the data for you, or you're collecting the data yourself, it's really important to know what's actually being measured. There's lots of measures out there that sound the same, but they're not. Awareness. Sounds like something simple, right? Are people aware of me? My brand. Well, how is awareness measured? There is unaided awareness. Unaided means, how many, if I were to ask you about laundry detergents, how many could you name? How many brands could you name? That's one way to measure awareness. And by the way, what we're measuring there is what's often referred to as top of mind. It's things that really come to mind when I ask you about detergents or automobiles, or pick your product category. On the other hand, I could ask you to look at a list of brands and tell me how many you've ever heard of. We call that aided recall. Guess what? People have heard of a lot more brands than they have top of mind. So when people are talking about awareness, what do they mean by awareness? Do they mean top of mind? Do they mean people have ever heard of? It actually turns out that top of mind is much more predictive of what people will buy than simple recognition of a brand name. Are there measures of preference? There are lots of ways to measure preference. Simple little scale. Do you intend to buy whatever the brand is in the next week? That's kind of an absolute measure. On the other hand, I could give you a list of competitors and say, which one would you buy from this list? It's also preference, but now it's in a competitive context. So it's important to know what I'm measuring. And again, knowing that people are going to buy my product in an absolute sense can be useful, but what's really predictive is what people choose out of the competitive set. We've already talked about market share can be defined in lots of different ways. What's the category? Loyalty. Term we throw out a lot. We'll talk about loyalty when we talk about customer lifetime value later in the class. What's a loyal customer? One simple measure of loyalty that you can get out of scanner data is a person buying the product today that they bought the last time. Very simple piece of information. But it actually turns out that people don't always buy the same brand over multiple occasions. In fact, it may be that people bought the same product on 2 occasions just by chance. Or it happened that when they bought the product, that product was on sale both times. So they weren't really buying the brand, they were buying the sale. So I could ask people about their loyalty. Rate on a 7-point scale, how loyal you are. But that's a measure of loyalty. Another way I could measure loyalty is, what's your favorite brand of toothpaste? And you can tell me that brand, and then say, great. Would you be willing to switch to competitor's brand if I gave you a 50% discount? Well, some people say, no, I would never switch. How about a 75% discount? How about an 80% discount? How about a 90% discount? And suddenly, when you start putting it in those economic terms, people who thought they were really loyal aren't so loyal anymore. What it means is they can be bought. But a really strong measure of loyalty is how resistant to a discount by a competitor an individual is. And I can measure that. I can do a survey, and I can determine how much of a discount would be required to get you to switch from one product to another. By the way, in some categories, for some customers, no amount of discounting will get people to switch. That's really powerful loyalty. When my daughters were younger, teenagers, I guess we got on some list as Coca-Cola drinkers, and so we had delivered to us as part of the promotion a case of Pepsi. And so we put it in the refrigerator, and my two daughters came home and we said, oh, there's Pepsi in the refrigerator. It's free. We didn't have to pay for it. My daughter's response was, dude, we don't drink that. Where's the Coke? That's called loyalty. When people won't take your product for free and prefer a competitor, that's loyalty. So when people talk about loyalty, you really want to understand what the loyalty measure is. What was actually measured? Even measures that have the same general operations may differ with respect to specific procedures or sample size. I measured customer satisfaction with automobiles with a sample of 100. By the way, what that means is that for some automobiles, I had no observations or one observation. I'm not sure I want to count on that as a measure of satisfaction. On the other hand, the measures that are widely used are based on tens of thousands of customers, so that for any one brand, I have several hundred customers, and I have a really robust, reliable measure of satisfaction. So you want to ask what you're buying, what you're obtaining, what the measure was really giving you. Most marketing measures that we use really are process measures, and this is why marketing is often a bit criticized, because we need lots of process measures to understand how our marketing is operating. A lot of our marketing is not intended to immediately cause people to jump out of their chair and go buy a product. It just doesn't work that way. If I could figure out how to write that kind of ad, I'd be a very wealthy man. What happens is that my ad makes people aware, creates some interest, and then when people get ready to buy, they go out and hopefully they remember my brand and they purchase it. And the criticism of marketing, though, is that it doesn't take us all the way to cash flow. But they are steps in the process of getting to cash flow. I won't get any cash from a customer who doesn't know about my product. I won't get any cash from a customer who can't get my product. So these measures are very important for diagnosis and planning. They're also very important for understanding the efficiency of what we're doing. Even if we have reason to believe measures that indicate something's working, is there a more efficient way to get the same result? Again, I've shown you this before. I'm going to keep repeating it. If you don't remember it in the class, I have failed. But again, some process measures that give us information about what to do, but ultimately can be converted into cash flow. There's market share out there, multiply that times the units in the marketplace, the margins I get, and I've got cash flow. But my example here, what percentage of people are aware of the product? I can measure that with a survey. How many people can get the product? That's a distribution issue. How many people intend to purchase? Well, if it's 10% here, 80% here, 20% here, I've got a 4% market share. But my problem here, which is why I said this is diagnostic, my problem is an awareness problem, and I really need to advertise to raise awareness. In contrast, I may have a lot of awareness, but not much distribution. Again, good intent to purchase, I gain a 4% market share. And if I'm only looking at market share or the cash flow associated with my product, I'm not going to know that the problem here is I've got a distribution issue. Awareness issue here, distribution issue here. And then I've got a product out there, everybody knows about it, everybody could get it, it's well distributed, it's just nobody intends to buy it. By the way, the best way to assure a product dies, a really bad product dies, is to advertise. Get people to try it once. Well, this is a situation where my diagnostic information tells me I need to improve the product. There are all kinds of intermediate marketing metrics. This is a table out of your textbook. It's a part of the table anyway. And I'm not going to read all of these through for you, but there are lots and lots of these intermediate market metrics. Depending on your job, depending on your organization, some will be more relevant to you than others. If you're in an industry where advertising is really important, there are a lot of advertising metrics that will be important. Things like GRPs, as an example. Cost per thousand, which is an efficiency measure we use in print media. Cost per thousand. How much does it cost to reach 1,000 people? On the other hand, if you're in a business-to-business setting, advertising may be trivial. You may do a little bit, but probably not much. You may be depending on a sales force, and now measures that relate to the sales force become important. If you're Boeing and you're selling airplanes, yeah, Boeing does some advertising, but mostly their selling really occurs through sales personnel. And so I need measures that relate to how many sales calls are occurring. How many of those sales calls are turning into requests for proposals? How many of those requests for proposals are turning into sales? So a different set of metrics. In thinking about measures that you might use, there's some characteristics of measures you should consider. One of those characteristics is what we call reliability. If I measured once and then measured again, would I get the same result? That's reliability. A second issue to be concerned about is validity. Am I measuring what I think I'm measuring? Now let me give you a silly example to illustrate these. If I were to measure the length of your nose today and measure it again tomorrow, I would probably get the same value. That's a reliable measure. On the other hand, if I said, I'm going to measure your intelligence, let me measure the length of your nose. There's really not much relationship between the length of your nose and intelligence. So it's not a valid measure. Then part of what you want to ask when you talk with firms about measures is it reliable? How do you know it's reliable? Do you have any data that shows that it's reliable? And how do you know it's valid? And then how precise is it? That is, how much error is in it? because if measures have a lot of error, then they're not going to be very useful. Every so often, Walmart decides not to play nice, and they won't let Nielsen have their data. In some categories, Walmart is 40% of the category. Well, if I'm missing 40% of the category, I don't have much precision. So it's really important to understand how much error is present. And then finally, obviously, what's the cost? Generally, more reliable, more valid, and more precise measures cost more. There are several types of reliability, not all of which actually concern us in marketing, but there are two types in marketing that do concern us. One is test-retest. I measure once, I measure again. I measure brand preference today, I measure brand preference tomorrow. My measures either agree or they don't agree, or they agree to some extent. Usually measures of reliability are measured with correlation coefficients. So something that's totally unreliable is a 0, and something that's totally unreliable is 0, and something that's 1 is perfectly reliable. Most of our measures are not perfectly reliable. There's some change. Sometimes, rather than using a rating scale, something I ask people about, I may have observers, I may have raters. So, for example, it's often the case that we will send in secret shoppers to identify the quality of service in an establishment. We'd like to know the degree to which the individuals, observers, agree with one another. Again, we can compute the degree of agreement, determine. For validity, mostly we're concerned about what we call criterion validity, the degree to which a measure actually predicts something of interest, either something we already can measure or something that we measure at some point in the future. There are other kinds of validity, but again, typically validity is measured from 0, no predictive ability, to 1, very predictive. And if you're acquiring a measure, let's say a measure of the persuasiveness of advertising, what you might like to know is, does that measure actually predict what people choose after they've seen the advertising? And in a couple of weeks, I'll show you an example of such a measure that's commonly used in assessing advertising. We've talked a bit about precision. It's really simply how accurate the measure is. It's the inverse of error. It's often a function of sample size, but not always. In the world of big data, people often have millions of records, but those millions of records may not actually be representative of the market. They may be representative of customers of one firm, but if you're trying to make inferences about the market as a whole, you're going to have a lot of error, because there's a systematic difference between the people for whom you have data and the people for whom you don't have data. None of these metrics that we've talked about are really substitutes for financial metrics. At the end of the day, we're in a business, and the outcome that we're interested in is cash flow. The marketing metrics are really important because they help us understand what's in the black box. You know, I pour money in R&D, in advertising, in sales force, collateral material, other kinds of marketing activities, and hopefully the other side comes out cash. Well, I don't want marketing to be a black box, because in many organizations, marketing accounts for about 25% of the total expenditures of the company. That's a lot of money to spend on a black box. So it's really important to try to understand what's happening inside that black box. Determine whether or not we can get better outcomes, cash flow, at the back end, or whether we can get more efficiency out of what we're doing on the front end. And that's why all of these intermediate marketing metrics are really so important. The problem is that in most organizations, the marketing people only look inside the black box. They never relate what's happening in the black box to the financial outcome, which is why you have people criticizing marketing, particularly people in the finance area, people on the board, CEOs. Yeah, it's wonderful that you've created great brand loyalty. What does that buy me? What does that do for my cash flow? You're spending all of this money. What are we getting for our investment? And so, it's important to think about how they all fit together. So there are all kinds of process measures that are really important to monitor. Things like awareness, things about our performance, satisfaction, things about knowledge, customer measures, brand loyalty, purchase intention, willingness to recommend. Those then feed into things like market performance measures, like margins. One reason why we want people to be brand loyal is because brand loyal people tend to be willing to pay more for the product. Direct effect on margins. Marketing activities have an influence on sales velocity, how much I'm actually selling. And then ultimately those market performance metrics flow into financial performance. Costs, sales revenue, which produces cash flow. Most marketers in most organizations never look at the top of this, and they get criticized. And it's actually becoming a problem. Coca-Cola no longer has a chief marketing officer. They have a chief innovation officer. McDonald's no longer has a chief marketing officer. They have a chief growth officer. And the reason for that is that they want people who are going to be focused on the upper end of that diagram, not just the marketing part.